We are the paradoxical ape. Bipedal, naked, large-brained, long the master of fire, tools, and language, but still trying to understand ourselves. Aware that death is inevitable, yet filled with optimism. We grow up slowly. We hand down knowledge. We empathize and deceive. We shape the future from our shared understanding of the past. CARTA brings together experts from diverse disciplines to exchange insights on who we are and how we got here. An exploration made possible by the generosity of humans like you.
The next speaker is Timothy Tangolini on the topologies of belief, folklore, conspiracy theories, and threat.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I like that introduction. Everybody else has been really positive, and now you're going to tell us how incredibly doomed we are. So it's a wonderful way to end a lovely day of positive analysis of storytelling. I'm a folklorist, and so it's the second person who's come out and said that. It's almost confessional in that way. And as a folklorist, I study vernacular informal culture and its circulation on and across social networks. We're interested in dynamic processes of variation and stability. How and why do ideas persist? I'm also deeply interested in the relationship between cultural expressive forms and the members of groups, how stories, how expressive culture plays into the dynamics of group membership. Folklore, and particularly storytelling, is remarkably efficient at encapsulating and communicating cultural ideology. These are norms, beliefs, and values, and we use stories as an ongoing negotiation of this. Now, in my work, I've focused predominantly on legends and rumors, which are sources of information that thrive in low-trust, low-information environments. And it could also be an and in there, so low-trust and low-information environments. Now, as a folklorist, I use genre terms that might not be familiar to everybody. Legend in this context is short, believable, mono-episodic narratives told as true in an informal setting, often conversationally. So they're very much like personal experience narratives, the stories that you tell friends over pizza. Rumor is a hyperactive transmission state of legend, and a lot of times it leaves off part of the legend itself, which is retrospective. It usually says, here's a threat, what are you going to do about it? It's basically Ghostbusters. There's a well-known model of legend structure which was based on personal experience narrative, later modified by a great colleague, Nicolaisen, to fit contemporary legends and archival collections, and it had 6 main structural components: summary, orientation, complicating action, the what happened, evaluations, oh my God, I didn't know that happened to Bob, a result, what happened, then a coda, yeah, and he was okay, the what finally happened. The problem I always had with this was that this complicating action was wildly under-theorized. And so I started working with colleagues on trying to theorize this, and it really is made up of 2 distinct parts. When we're telling stories, a lot of times there's some sort of threat or disruption. And that threat or disruption is going to affect the status quo, and we don't like that. And we've already heard that. As humans, we don't like things that are out of the ordinary. So the range of threats or disruptions are going to be limited, right? They can't be unlimited. It's not an infinite worlds model, but rather they're limited and they're determined by our group. They're culturally determined. And then there's a second part to this, which is strategy. So here's a threat of disruption, what are you going to do about it? And that's why I say it's like Ghostbusters. When ghosts appear in the neighborhood, you're going to shout out. Come on, you all know. Who are you going to call? And the answer to that is always ideological. So the success of a failure or strategy constitutes this ideological evaluation of the possible strategies for counteracting a threat. And we do this as humans all the time. It might be tiny little stories. It might be very major stories. So one of the questions I have is, why on earth do we tell so many threat narratives? And this goes to questions of fear, uncertainty, and making sense of information. Now, somebody told me once that if you're going to give a talk and you want people to remember it, always show a picture of a brain, even though you're not a neuroscientist and really have no reason, or actually it's irresponsible of you to show that. I was talking to a colleague, Lily Mujica Parodi, who's been working on human risk-taking and fear circuits, and she was telling me about these two fear circuits that appear to have the fear circuit that appears to have two paths, a low road and a high road. At the first perception of threat, the low road circuit, which is very fast, is activated and gets you, and this is using visual stimuli, gets you into that mode of, whoa, is that a threat? I better get ready for that is. And the high road keeps asking for more information. And recall, I was talking about storytelling in the context of low information situations. So we're constantly asking, is this something I have to be concerned about? Is this something I have to be concerned about? Is this something I have to be concerned about? And we're using narrative to help us understand that, even if it's not a visual stimulus right in front of us. Just 2 weeks ago, this paper came out that we're still working through. I'm not quite sure I totally understand it, but the semantic reconstruction of continuous language from non-invasive brain recordings. More brain pictures, so you'll definitely remember this. But it seems to be related to this idea of semantic encodings that we get from non-visual stimuli. That could be very exciting. There might be an understanding at hand for neurophysiological basis for these threat narratives. If narrative stimuli present a potential threat, might they activate some sort of series of circuits similar to those activated by the visual stimuli? This probably is not a new idea. I'm actually quite sure it's not a new idea, but maybe we can start to measure this, right? And so the idea of being able to measure narrative response, and why this is so seemingly baked in could be a very interesting development. Like I said, it's not really what I do. Really what I do is I untangle stories, and I'm trying to do this in a consistent manner. We look at discourse, we look at the underlying narrative frameworks, these frameworks that we're all walking around with, that we're constantly trying to adjust to other people in our group, and then looking at how we activate those frameworks in conversation, whether it's in person, like folklorists are so very interested in, or if it's virtual, these communities that we seem to have joined ever since the advent of the iPhone, and think that they are our friends. So these narrative framework structures that we're able to estimate from large amounts of storytelling present with topological features of the networks and show how the interlocking stories can create stability across time and perhaps even across languages and cultures. The other thing that we've started to explore is how simple threat narratives can be linked together to form complex representations of threatening outsiders or threatening outside groups. That is to say, not one group, but series of groups that wherever you turn, it turns out that people are arrayed against you. That could have considerable impact on various communities and the way people see the world. We often talk about communities of belief, and we create those communities of belief by sharing stories with one another. What's interesting is that what's terrifying, is that these frameworks appear to have considerable stability across time once they've been established. And if you think about that just for a second, what I'm saying is that once beliefs are established, and they're often negotiated through these stories within close homogeneous groups, once they're established, they're stable across time. So are we doomed? Yes. How do we do this? Unfortunately, the computational pipeline for extracting these is a little bit complicated. And we do make use of our AI overlords there in step 15. I started working with this on some Danish witchcraft legends because in my world, nothing is more scary than a Danish witch. And if you recall your 4th grade Danish, you should be able to read along with me and see that et sted I Sundeved boede en kone, som hed Else Michaels. Denne kone gik omkring og gjorde så mange fortræd. Hun tog mælken fra koerne. She stole the milk from the cows, okay? And so that's really what she's doing here. She also snuck into the houses, she hurt the pigs, and she would turn herself into a rabbit, or a hare actually, when the girls came out to milk the cows. One day when she was running around, somebody shot her, and she lay in bed for a really long time. They shot her actually probably with a silver button. So we can then extract from this all of the different actants and the relationships in this one little story about a witch. And we see that the witch harms the farm animals, the workers use tools and they care for the farm animals that are being harmed by the witch who steals farm produce. And we get all of these simple relationships in that one story, and we can extract those automagically. We aggregate that then over hundreds of stories, and we actually get a pretty good framework for all of the witch stories in 19th century Denmark, and we get a sense of how this works. And if you want to tell a Danish witch story, all you need to do is sample over that graph with some sort of probability, and you can tell a story about witches. The other thing we did, of course, being network scientists, is we started to look for separating sets. What types of things are connecting this story together? And so we find the realm of farm work, which is not a story at all. It's just everyday life. And we find the world of witches, which is quite separate. We find the world of cunning folk, who are actually local agents who fight the witches, and if your strategy is fight the witch by yourself, you usually lose, but if you fight the witch with the cunning folk, you often win. If you turn to the minister, the problem is that the minister's wife is a witch, and she gets her powers from Satan. You can't actually turn to the person who owns the farm, because the person who owns the farm because Satan gave them a deal on a farm. Do you want to buy a farm? Yes, I am Satan. And so that was actually really interesting, because we saw how Danish farm workers in the late 19th century, when they were confronted with shifting economic sands, started to link all of these different threat narratives together and started to come up with local solutions for these highly local problems. We also find these interdependent domains. Some of our work was also looking at mommy blogs and vaccine hesitancy, and the weird persistence of anti-vaccination ideas going all the way back apparently to the history of the Peloponnesian War. We looked at mommy blogs because we knew that as new parents, and when we started this work, I was actually also a new parent. When you go to the hospital, they give you no instruction manual. They give you a small, cute, bundled child, and they basically say, keep it alive. And you think, okay, how do I do that? I'm thinking better vaccinate. But a lot of people go to mommy blogs where they can then get exposed to these ideas, even if they don't harbor these ideas themselves, of, whoa, don't vaccinate, way too many shots, way too quickly. And this feels really weird to say in the Salk Institute. By 2014, it was very clear that families in the US were either under-vaccinating or not vaccinating their children, to which my response was, because I am a Scandinavian scholar and Munch's scream seemed like the right reaction. We wanted to know who were these people, what were their concerns, how were they talking to each other, what were they saying. We knew that CDC's one-size-fits-all messaging had failed. So we went on the mommy blogs and we did some topic modeling and discovered actually this enormous topic called exemption, which nobody had been talking about. We thought, oh, maybe we should apply our methods to this. And so we started to find actant relationship classes. So these were the types of actants we were looking at and their various subactant groups. And a sample story would be something like this. A friend of my daughter got her shots for this one, now has multiple health issues, anxiety attacks, rashes, a lot of fatigue. My girl is not getting them, no way. That's a very complicated story. It looks sort of like this. And when we started to do this over millions of posts, we found out that actually what these stories were saying is not that the vaccine-preventable diseases were the threat, but rather the vaccines are the threat. So in the storytelling, the threat agent is the vaccine. Well, if you're a parent, then it's obvious what your strategy is. Don't get the vaccine. But if the vaccine-preventable diseases had been the threat, well, then the obvious suggestion is get the vaccine. How do we get to a position where we can start to shift those stories, because the vaccine-preventable diseases are a threat, not so much the vaccines. So that was something that was deeply troubling. Of course, at the same time, that brought us then to conspiracy theories, because these started to link all of these domains of threat and threat narrative together. We started looking at Pizzagate and Stop the Steal. If you recall, Pizzagate is where the Democrats were trafficking children for cannibalistic satanic ritual in pizza parlors under the ground in Northwest Washington, D.C. And so this is work I did with the narrative modeling group. A lot of this is with this narrative modeling group at UCLA. What we discovered was that all of these domains of normal human interaction were getting linked together by the fanciful interpretation of some valuable information that only a few people perhaps had access to. And in the lone wolf model, it's one person who can interpret the tea leaves, as it were. But in what we were seeing on social media was it's a group of people who are coming together and almost gamifying this and enjoying the creation of community to create a series of interlock narratives. And if you see here on the left, when we took away the interpretation of WikiLeaks, which you see over on the right, the projection of the aggregate is one giant connected component. When we take away just the WikiLeaks by itself, all of these narrative domains drop out into independent narrative domains. When you see the projection, they're not connected components. That shows that you can, wow, hey, that's great. We can just attack conspiracy theories by attacking that very small separating set. Yes, the problem is it's Terminator 2. They're not robust, they're incredibly resilient. You can just put the edges right back in narratively. So there was a global pandemic, don't know if you noticed that. And so we did the exact same thing to all of social media and discovered actually conspiracy theories and just discussions, storytelling in the early days of COVID-19 had highly separated communities, narrative communities with separate contexts. Unfortunately, as it went on, QAnon came in and started discovering shared nodes across those contexts. Some of the contexts we found were this weird one where there was some sort of giant node in the middle. We don't know what that is yet. But Bill Gates, 5G cell phone towers, and vaccinations were all tied together narratively by the storytellers. There's a lot more there, but I've only got a minute and 32 seconds left, and I still have 18 slides. So we were really concerned with these ideas of inside, outside, liminal, friend, enemy, trying to understand these narrative groupings, and it turns out, not surprisingly, that threats are context dependent. And so we developed a method for sorting through the threats dependent on the contexts in which the the thing was mentioned, right? So microchips could actually be really good, or microchips could be really bad. Cell phone towers could be really good or really bad, and that would depend on the context and then what we should do about them. Either we should build more of them or we should go out and destroy them. And we saw this kind of sorting, and we did this over millions of posts and found some kind of things that were really good: insiders, family members, faith, American human rights, communities, and things that were really bad. What I thought was interesting was the smallpox vaccine was worse than Mussolini. We don't know what's going on. And then we thought, well, wait a second, there's also something more going on here. There's a kind of a structural balance kind of thing going on, where parts of something that gets introduced into a graph gets aligned with other parts of the graph in a multi-hop situation. The basis of this idea is, again, that actants and groups of actants become aligned in the process of storytelling. So as I start telling stories, I start sorting things out. Groups of actants that define an inside group and others that define outsiders, where outsiders are often disruptive and threatening. And so the question is, given a corpus of domain-specific free-form text, can I construct a model to discover the actant groups that undergird the disparate narratives in that domain? And of course, I wouldn't be asking that question if the answer isn't yes, I can do that. Why might I want to do this? It could provide insight into the transfer of ideology across narrative space. So here's an example of what we're working with. I won't read it because now I'm really pushing my time limit here. But you can see that you start to get these alignments in the narrative space. And you get a subnetwork, in this case about the Second Amendment. But as we have these different nodes pass messages to each other, narratively telling each other what they're aligned with, we actually get a very nice distribution of insiders and outsiders, where depending on which side you're standing on, will give you a different idea of insiders, outsiders. Why might this be important? Well, these guys. Their threat was stolen election. Their strategy was take over the Capitol. And so I asked my group, can we discover this in noisy forums in places like Parler? To do that, we had to rely on turtles and the semantic consistency and narrative frameworks. So we took all of Parler, we cleaned the posts, we ran it through our pipeline described above, and we started to find graphs like this. The graphs were so dense, and there were so many of them, that we then relied on a different type of graph-based decomposition and started to look for semantic consistency in these groups. What's interesting about this technique is it gives us sort of the spines of what's holding a network together. This top series of glyphs are the different levels of decomposition, and we shouldn't have this regular pattern that we're finding unless the conversation is absolutely consistent. That's why I said turtles all the way down. Parler, it turns out, becomes absolutely semantically and narratively consistent way back in November. And what is the consistency? Well, we've got at the very top level Trump and election truth as what's holding it together. And as we go further down, we start to get, on one level, we get this idea of corruption, and Trump is sort of the bulwark against this corruption. He's the one in the center there with truth. And it just keeps going further and further down with, what isn't obvious here is that BLM tactic, right? They are suggesting they will use the same tactics as the Black Lives Matter movement in their protest in the Capitol. And then it continues on down through the levels. This is a very unusual finding, but not perhaps surprising given what we then saw was the outcome of these conversations, where the decision on who the outsiders were and what the strategy should be were immediately apparent to the group. And the negotiation then over the weeks wasn't so much who were the bad guys and what had happened, but rather, what should we do about it? And we see that again and again on these social media sites where people come to these conversations, they get exposed to the conversation, beliefs that they perhaps didn't hold all of a sudden become part of their own beliefs, and the strategies that are proposed within this discursive frame are then the strategies that they appropriate. Wow, that's really negative. Positive things about this. I'm interested then in how we can address this. I think one of the problems with social media and storytelling is that in the types of work that we were doing as folklorists before, we were really interested in low-level face-to-face interaction that had social breaks baked in, right? If I were starting to talk about these crazy things, you would look at me, you'd say, Tim, stop, and I would stop because I want to be part of the group. If I'm on social media, it's like going into a bar and trying to find friends who are talking about things that you're talking about. If it's a normal bar, I go in and I see a bunch of robots sitting at the table, I'm not going to sit down with them and start talking. On social media, you don't know that they are robots that you're talking to. And the speed, the directionality, the velocity of these stories is, I think, something new, and it's something that we should be aware of. This is collaborative work. I want to thank all of these people, Vwani Roy Chowdhury, James Abello, Pete Broadwell, great graduate students, Pavan Hola, Haiyang Zhang, and then my undergraduate team who worked on Parler. I couldn't believe I gave undergraduates that data. But they were game. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.